What if I told you that some of the world's most sophisticated art was created in Africa centuries before Europeans knew what a museum was, and that the British liked it so much they decided to borrow it permanently? The Benin Bronzes represent one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements and one of history's most brazen cultural thefts. These aren't just pretty sculptures sitting in British museums. They're the stolen soul of an entire civilization, masterpieces so advanced that European visitors couldn't believe Africans had created them. From the royal palaces of the Benin Empire to the halls of the British Museum, this is the story of art so extraordinary that it sparked an international debate about cultural ownership that's still raging today. Let's dive into how a West African kingdom created artistic perfection, and how the British decided that finders keepers applied to an entire culture's heritage. Long before Europeans were carving crude figures in stone, the Benin Empire, in what's now Nigeria, was producing art that would make Renaissance masters weep with envy. Founded in the 11th century, the Benin Empire wasn't just another African kingdom. It was a sophisticated civilization that turned art into both cultural expression and political power. The capital city of Benin was described by European visitors as larger and more organized than London, with wide boulevards, elaborate palaces, and artistic decorations that covered every surface. The Oba, or King of Benin, was the central figure in an artistic ecosystem that employed thousands of craftsmen specializing in bronze casting, ivory carving, and woodworking. The royal court maintained artist guilds whose techniques were passed down through generations like state secrets. What made Benin unique was how deeply art was woven into society. Every important event was commemorated in bronze. These weren't decorative trinkets, but historical records, religious artifacts, and political statements rolled into lasting works of art. The empire controlled vast trade networks from the Atlantic coast deep into Africa's interior. European traders visiting Benin in the 15th and 16th centuries wrote home describing artistic sophistication that rivaled anything in Europe. By the time the British showed up with their colonial ambitions, they found an empire that had been perfecting artistic techniques for over 500 years. The royal palace complex alone contained thousands of bronze plaques, sculptures, and ceremonial objects that represented the accumulated artistic genius of dozens of generations. The technical skill required to create the Benin Bronzes was so advanced that European metalworkers couldn't figure out how they were made. The lost wax casting technique used by Benin artists was more sophisticated than anything being produced in Europe at the time. The process began with incredibly detailed wax models, capturing every facial expression, every texture of clothing, every intricate pattern with photographic precision. These wax models were then covered in clay, heated until the wax melted away, and filled with molten bronze to create the final sculpture. But here's where it gets really impressive. Each bronze was a unique work of art demonstrating individual creativity within established artistic traditions. The level of detail they achieved was extraordinary. You can see individual teeth in smiling faces, the texture of woven fabric, the pattern of tribal scarification, and the intricate designs of royal regalia. Benin metalworkers created specific bronze alloys by combining copper, tin, and zinc in precise proportions that gave their bronzes distinctive color and durability. Different alloys were used for different types of objects. Ceremonial pieces used one mixture, decorative panels another, and royal portraits yet another. The artists worked in specialized workshops within the royal palace complex, using tools that were themselves works of art. Their crucibles, molds, and casting equipment were passed down through generations of master craftsmen who spent decades perfecting techniques that European metalworkers would struggle to replicate even today. What's mind-blowing is the scale of production. The royal palace contained thousands of bronze plaques that covered the wooden pillars supporting the structure. Each plaque told part of the empire's story, creating a three-dimensional history book that surrounded visitors with artistic narratives of conquest, ceremony, and royal power. To understand why the theft of the Benin Bronzes was so devastating, you need to understand that these weren't just decorative objects. They were the spiritual and cultural DNA of an entire civilization. Every bronze plaque in the royal palace told a specific story that was essential to Benin's cultural identity. Some depicted historical events like military victories or diplomatic meetings. Others showed religious ceremonies that connected the living world to the realm of ancestors. Still others portrayed the genealogy of royal families, serving as three-dimensional family trees that validated political authority. The bronzes weren't just historical records, they were active participants in Benin's spiritual life. Certain sculptures were believed to house the spirits of deceased obas, making them religious artifacts that connected the present royal court to the wisdom and power of previous rulers. Removing these objects wasn't just theft. It was spiritual vandalism that severed the connection between the living and the dead. The artistic techniques themselves carried cultural meaning. The way eyes were depicted, the positioning of hands, the patterns carved into clothing. All of these elements communicated specific information about social status, religious beliefs, and cultural values that could be read by anyone familiar with Benin artistic traditions. Royal portraits weren't just meant to look like individual rulers. They were designed to embody the spiritual essence of kingship itself. The elaborate coral bead regalia, the distinctive crown designs, the ceremonial weapons depicted in the bronzes all carried symbolic meaning that reinforced the Oba's connection to divine authority. In 1897, the British Empire committed what might be history's most well-documented act of cultural theft, disguised as a punitive expedition. The official story was that Benin had attacked a British delegation, killing several officials and creating a diplomatic crisis that required military intervention. The real story was that Britain wanted to control Benin's lucrative trade networks and saw an opportunity to eliminate a powerful African kingdom that was interfering with colonial expansion. The British assembled a military force of over 1,200 men equipped with modern rifles, machine guns, and artillery to attack a kingdom whose primary weapons were still swords and spears. This wasn't a war. It was a massacre disguised as a military operation. When British forces captured Benin City in February 1897, they found a royal palace complex that contained one of the world's greatest art collections. Instead of recognizing the cultural significance of what they'd discovered, they saw dollar signs. The looting was systematic and thorough. British officers stripped the palace of thousands of bronze plaques, sculptures, ivory carvings, and ceremonial objects. They literally pried bronze panels off the palace walls, packed up entire royal regalia collections, and carted away centuries of accumulated artistic treasures. But here's the most cynical part. The British immediately began selling the stolen art to fund their military expedition. Auctions were held in London, where Benin bronzes were sold to private collectors, museums, and art dealers across Europe and America. The cultural heritage of an entire civilization was turned into a commodity to pay for the military operation that had destroyed it. Today, thousands of Benin bronzes are scattered across museums, private collections, and auction houses around the world, while the people of Nigeria are left with empty walls where their cultural heritage once hung. The British Museum alone holds over 900 Benin objects, making it the largest repository of stolen African art in the world. These pieces form one of the museum's most popular exhibitions, generating millions in revenue from visitors who come to see African masterpieces that were obtained through military conquest and cultural theft. But London isn't the only city profiting from Benin's stolen heritage. Major museums in New York, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna all have significant collections of Benin bronzes. Universities, private collectors, and smaller museums across Europe and America have pieces that were dispersed during the original auctions and subsequent sales. The financial value of these stolen objects is staggering. Individual Benin bronzes have sold at auction for millions of dollars, making the total value of looted objects worth hundreds of millions. Meanwhile, Nigeria struggles to fund basic museum infrastructure while watching their cultural heritage generate profits for Western institutions. Recent years have seen growing pressure for repatriation, but the response from Western museums has been frustratingly slow. Some institutions have returned a few pieces in high-profile ceremonies that generate positive publicity while keeping the vast majority of their collections. Others argue that they're universal museums that can better preserve and display African art than African institutions, a position that many see as a continuation of colonial paternalism. The legal arguments are complex, but the moral argument is simple. These objects were stolen from their creators and should be returned to their homeland. Nigeria has built state-of-the-art museums and conservation facilities specifically designed to house returned Benin Bronzes, contradicting claims that they can't properly care for their own cultural heritage. The story of the Benin Bronzes symbolizes the broader struggle for cultural repatriation affecting museums worldwide. Every year without repatriation denies Nigerian artists, students, and practitioners access to their heritage. These objects aren't just art. They're textbooks, spiritual artifacts, and inspiration sources that could inform contemporary African practice if returned. Arguments against repatriation reveal persistent colonial attitudes, assuming Western institutions are better custodians than Africans themselves, ignoring Nigeria's sophisticated museum infrastructure and growing conservation expertise. But change is happening. Public opinion shifts, younger museum professionals question inherited collections, and African governments demand return of cultural property. The conversation has moved from whether repatriation should happen to how quickly it can be implemented. The Benin Bronzes represent one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements, created by a civilization that understood beauty, craftsmanship, and cultural expression at the highest levels. They deserve to be reunited with the people who created them, in the land where their cultural significance can be fully understood and appreciated. If you enjoyed learning about the incredible artistry of the Benin Empire and the ongoing fight to return their stolen treasures, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more stories about African civilizations that created wonders the world is still trying to understand.